I'm very grateful for the chance to speak with you, and it was wonderful to hear the presentation this morning from the Minister and from Nuno Creto. Your Minister has a broad, detailed and nuanced understanding of the challenges in education, and he takes an enlightened approach to using research and evidence to inform the reforms that he's putting in place. And this is very similar to what is happening where I come from in Australia. I know that many people have travelled a long way to come to this conference, but I think maybe no one has travelled as far as I have. Anybody want to try and compete? It's a long way. Australia is very large, but our population is very small, very similar to Morocco. We're complicated. We have one country, about 9 governments, 1 Commonwealth minister and 8 state ministers. It's a very complicated education environment. But those ministers came together not very many years ago and agreed that there were things not going well in education in Australia. Like Morocco, we do PISA testing, we do TIMS, we do PEARLS, we do other assessments as well. And there was some cause for concern. Our results had been good, but they've been declining. An equity gap has been growing bigger. Students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds have been getting very poor results and not improving. And our teaching workforce is declining and their satisfaction is waning. So we have big problems to fix. And the ministers, all 9 of them, came together and decided they wanted to create an agency that could look at the research in education to decide what we might do better, how we could go about improving our system so that students' learning will improve. Now, I should say, if I was speaking to an audience of teachers in Australia at this time of day, they would be very unhappy with me. At this time of day, the students have gone home and the teachers are finishing their workday. So you are all here still listening to me, and I hope I will make it worth your while, and I thank you for your patience. I think there are many things in common between what we are doing in Australia and what you are trying to do in Morocco, and I think maybe I can have some useful information to share with you. Now, let me try this again. When the ministers decided they would set up my agency, we're called the Australian Education Research Organisation, or AERO. They wanted to make sure that everything we do in education is informed by the best available research and evidence. So the vision that we crafted is a vision for excellence and equity in education for all children and young people through the effective use of evidence. And we go about our work in 3 ways. We do research, we generate evidence, we undertake new research into questions for which there are currently no good answers. We also translate the evidence that already exists. There is a huge amount of research in education, much of it not very good, much of it very dense and difficult to access and understand. So a big part of the work that we do at AERO is translate that research, filter it for the research that is good, is very important information, and we put it into documents that are easy to read, accessible for busy teachers and school leaders, and we make sure that they understand the important points that it's making. And the last thing we do is encourage the adoption and implementation of that evidence into practice in schools and systems. It's very easy to be a researcher in education. You can do research, you can publish it on a website, but there is a real risk it won't change anything if teachers don't use it, if teachers don't know about it, and they don't value it, and they don't understand how to put it into practice confidently. So we focus a great deal on What does it take to get research off the website and into the classroom? Now, I'm going to tell you about what the research has told us about the most effective approaches to teaching. We're all in the business of making sure that students learn, and we all want the best outcomes for them, and we know how to go about getting them. We don't currently do that in a systematic way. Before I tell you what we know from the research, I want to describe to you a mystery. Once upon a time, there was a very important research study. It was called Project Follow Through. It was the most expensive evaluation study in education ever undertaken. It is a study that many people, at least in my country, have not heard of. Yet it is a study that we as educators should all know very well. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It goes right back to 1964. The President of the United States declared a war on poverty and decided that education would be the solution. A program called Head Start was implemented for children in kindergarten, preschool, before school, to grade 3. And it was a very popular program, and it showed good signs for the children participating. But early evaluations suggested that most of the improvements were lost as the children continued through primary school. So the President decided there needed to be a follow-through project that would ensure the early improvements in educational achievement continued throughout the later school years. This meant they needed to understand what worked, and it resulted in the launch of the largest educational experiment ever conducted. Follow-through provided a unique opportunity to study the effectiveness of a variety of educational methods. In effect, it created a national learning laboratory of schools all over the country. There had been no prior attempts to systematically vary teaching methods in order to assess their relative effectiveness. In this study, over 300,000 children in 178 communities were included, and 22 different teaching approaches were compared. The communities that implemented the different approaches spanned the full range of demographic variables, different ethnicities, different levels of poverty, different geolocations. Parent groups in the participating communities got to choose which teaching approach they wanted to have implemented, and each school district agreed to implement that approach. Follow-through had very strong safeguards, ensuring that every participating district made sure all of the schools were well-resourced to use that approach, that students had medical and dental care, that everybody had access to adequate nutrition. So they made sure that the environment was conducive to being able to determine that the approach was the thing that was making the difference for the children. Now, evaluation of this approach occurred in 1977, 9 years after the project began, and the results were very strong and clear. Thank you. Students who received a program designed by Zig Engelman had significantly higher academic achievement than students in any of the other programs. They also had higher self-esteem and self-confidence, and they were better at problem solving. No other program had results that approached the positive impact of this program. It was the only one that consistently delivered successful learning. Subsequent research found that the students who had been taught with this program continued to outperform their peers, and they were more likely to finish high school and pursue higher education. Now, after this evaluation, at least 3 subsequent evaluations were conducted. I don't know why. This one's pretty compelling, but they did it all again 3 more times, and every time they got the same results. And here's the mystery. You might think that with such robust measures, the approach that this program took would be adopted quickly and universally. It was not. Ironically, Project Follow-Through became Project Never to be Heard of Again. For example, when I did my teacher training a long time ago now, this project was never mentioned. I never heard about Project Follow-Through, and I never heard about the program that was so successful. That program is called Direct Instruction, and it is what we now refer to as explicit instruction or explicit teaching practice. Let's fast forward to today. We're working in education at a very exciting time. For decades, we have had empirical data like this from research studies like Project Follow-Through that show explicit teaching practices like those employed in the direct instruction program were consistently leading to more and deeper learning than other practices. But we didn't have an explanation as to why. That empirical data has now been brought together with more recent insights from cognitive science. Cognitive science tells us about the brain's architecture and its processes, and bringing them together, empirical data about what works and what happens in brains, tells a very powerful story. We can see that explicit teaching practices are effective because they align with what we now know is happening in our brains when we learn. This never works well for me, but let's try it again. We now know learning involves knowledge being recorded into our long-term memories, and that enables us to recall it and apply it with ease. Having knowledge in long-term memory is essential for skills like creativity and problem solving, because they rely on us being able to access a large repertoire of knowledge and recombine pieces of knowledge in different ways. Nuno talked a little bit about this morning. We know that there is no known limit to how much knowledge we can fit into our long-term memory. Our brains are truly extraordinary things. But while there's no known limit to how much knowledge can be contained, unfortunately, there is a limit to how much can be squeezed in there at any one time. The gateway into long-term memory is our working memory, where we actively process information. It's in the processing of new information in working memory and linking it with information already stored in our long-term memory that information is transferred into the long-term memory. And that working memory is extremely limited in capacity. You know for yourself, if you try and remember 2 phone numbers at once, you run out of brain space. You need to chunk down the information into small pieces that you can learn and retain in your long-term memory before you try adding something new to it. If we overload working memory with too many new concepts at once, or with other distractions, it makes it far less likely that any of these concepts will be properly processed and embedded into our long-term memory. So in short, it makes it unlikely that learning will happen. As an example, this cognitive architecture warns us that we might want to beware of slides when imparting new information. If I'm telling you something at the same time as I'm showing you a complicated picture about it, it overloads your ability to process what I'm saying to you, and it makes it more difficult for you to absorb the information. Sorry about that. I needed some pictures. It's also the reason why inquiry-based learning, that is, when students are encouraged to set their own questions for learning and find out their own solutions, when inquiry-based learning is not heavily scaffolded by the teachers, it leads to worse outcomes. I think that we often intrinsically feel that something we discover for ourselves will be better retained than something that somebody has told us. There's a sort of rational appeal to inquiry-based or discovery learning. But in fact, it is not real. Yet when a student is trying to master new knowledge, making the students themselves engage with large volumes of non-target knowledge to find the correct knowledge themselves, as well as manage the processes of accessing and assessing the relevance of the content, all of this overloads their working memory. It results in the target knowledge being less likely to be effectively processed, learned and retained. And again, my friend Nuno talked about the problem of the OECD frequently telling us that a good approach to teaching is inquiry-based instruction, and it really isn't. There is no support for that approach. Explicit instruction is what delivers effective learning outcomes. Evidence-based explicit teaching practice respects the limitations of working memory. With explicit practice, new knowledge is broken down into small, sequenced chunks. It gets presented clearly, it has an expectation of mastery, and many opportunities for practicing and application before moving on to the next chunk and retrieval at a later date to consolidate learning. These are the central features of the direct instruction program that proved so effective in project follow-through. And these are the features of the approach that we call explicit teaching today. Now, this is a complicated picture, but I want to use it to explain that knowing and using the most effective teaching practices really matters, because learning is cumulative. And if children miss learning early in their schooling, then it's going to make it extremely difficult for them to build on that learning as they move through school. This is a picture of the assessment that we do in Australia. In Australia, we're very fortunate. Nuno, again, referred to assessment and the importance of assessment with good curriculum this morning. In Australia, we run a national assessment program, and every year we assess literacy and numeracy of children in years 3, 5, 7 and 9. So in their primary schooling and their secondary schooling. And we assess all of the children. So this is a picture of some analysis we did of the children when they were in year 3, and they did their assessment, and it showed that their results were very poor. We had about 200,000 children whose results were very poor in year 3. And our analysis is looking at what happened to these children when they were assessed in year 5, and then in year 7, and then again in year 9. And what the analysis shows us is that very few of them catch up. If they do, they catch up in year 5. But then they fall behind again. And most of them don't catch up at all. They fall further and further and further behind. And when they get to year 9, these are the children who have stopped attending school regularly, or they come to school and they disrupt their classes. This is a picture of what happens to children when learning gaps are allowed to emerge and they're not addressed. It accumulates, and they lack the knowledge to be able to engage with the curriculum as they move through their schooling. For Australia, it is a wonderful thing that we have this assessment. It is not a wonderful thing that we've been doing this assessment and not improving the outcomes for the children who have fallen behind. But now we have this analysis, and our ministers are determined we will do better. Now, I said I would talk to you about what our research found, and our early research, we were established in 2021, found very strongly and quickly the case for explicit instruction. And so a great deal of our work since 2021 has been about explaining explicit teaching and providing resources for teachers and school leaders so that they can understand it and begin to adopt it into their practice. This picture shows you a model which we created, which is a model showing how students learn and how teachers therefore should teach. It begins with how students learn so that teachers understand the cognitive science, because then it makes sense for them why we would like them to teach in an explicit way, because that's the way the brain is designed to learn. It works as a one-pager. You can find it on our website, but we have also developed a great deal of resources for teachers to use in their practice. So we have explainers and we have practice guides and we have videos of teachers. It is all in English, I'm sorry. One day we'll to translate, but I'm sure there's some magic on Google that would help people to translate the material that we have. I'll give you the website address for us as well at the end of the presentation. Because the ministers set us up and we are funded by government, everything that we do at Aero is freely available on our website. So it's there for everybody, and I encourage you to have a look. And I hope that you will find material there that will be of use. The first element in our model is enabling, which focuses on the conditions of a learning-focused environment. Enabling includes establishing relationships, teaching behavioural routines and rules, and creating safety in the classroom. Students cannot learn in a disruptive environment. And I don't know about Moroccan classrooms, but I know in Australian classrooms, they are very often disrupted environments. We survey our students and they report themselves that very often they cannot learn because the classroom is too noisy, or the class doesn't begin on time, or the children do not listen to the teachers. So in Australia, the first thing that we've done is develop a lot of resources to help teachers understand how they can effectively manage their classrooms so that learning can happen. It is the responsibility of the teacher to make sure that the classroom is an environment where learning can happen. So they must set the rules, they must determine the routines, and they must teach them to the children. They cannot assume that the children understand this. The children don't necessarily get taught about routines or obedience or good behaviour at home. It would be nice if they were, but they may not. So the teachers must do it. They must teach good behaviour and have high expectations for that behaviour. And that's a necessary precondition for explicit instruction to happen and for learning to take place. The second element of the model is planning. That's the work that the teachers must do to break down the knowledge that students will acquire. So it means going into the curriculum and thinking about the work that is to be taught, the content that is to be covered with the students, and making sure that it is broken down sufficiently that it won't overload their working memories and that they can build on small pieces of knowledge. The teachers need to chunk and sequence it, and they also need to plan for assessment. It is so important with explicit teaching that teachers always teach for mastery learning, that they don't ever move on with the content until they are confident that the students have mastered what they have been teaching. If the students haven't learned it, then the teaching hasn't finished. You can't move on and leave someone with a gap in their knowledge. The third phase of the model is instruction itself. Explicitly setting out for students the learning objective of the lesson, explicitly teaching the content and modelling what you want students to be able to do, and then carefully removing scaffolds, checking for understanding, providing feedback, and identifying the need for any additional support. The final phase is gradual release, and that is revisiting knowledge through spacing and retrieval to consolidate learning, teaching connections between knowledge to add complexity and abstraction, and providing increasingly challenging opportunities for students to apply and extend their knowledge. This is an evidence-based blueprint for maximising every student's learning in the classroom. The model is accessible on our website, and as I said, you can find many other materials as well. I should say that we did some research just to test whether this approach is only relevant in some contexts. We wanted to be confident that this approach is one that works for all students. And our research demonstrated very conclusively that it does. It works for students at all levels in their schooling, whether they're in primary or secondary schooling. It works for students from different kinds of backgrounds. It works for students who are poor, who are wealthy. It works for students who may have additional learning needs. It is so good and so appropriate, it's context proof. And the reason for that is we all work with human brains. We're not very different. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about is our efforts to try and make sure that all of this research and knowledge is put into practice in classrooms. We've been working directly with schools to support and learn about implementation. There are many examples of schools across Australia, and I'm sure here in Morocco as well, that are implementing evidence-based practices. Making and sustaining change to practice at a school level is really hard work. Some school leaders make it look easy, and they are heroes, but for the rest of us, there is something called implementation science. It's a new field, implementation science, and the evidence base is still emerging, but I think it is helpful, and I will share with you what we have learned in the last couple of years as we've been working in schools with this approach. Implementation is a series of planned activities aimed at integrating an evidence-based practice into a real-world setting. For schools, it's the bridge between knowing what works for improving student outcomes and embedding this into practice. Implementation is more complex than is typically recognised. It's not just a one-off activity like attending a professional learning session. You can't go to a session and come away knowing everything you need to be able to do this effectively in a sustained way. Instead, implementation research suggests that implementation is most likely to succeed and be sustained when schools take an approach that is deliberate and structured. A deliberate and structured approach to implementation begins with the school context, the where. It includes an evidence-based practice, the what, and it relies on 4 implementation components, the how. The where is your school. Context isn't just the backdrop for your implementation efforts, it's the things that are unique about your school that will influence your implementation choices. For example, you might start by considering what are your assessment results showing in order to choose where you might want to focus, maybe a particular subject area or a particular year level. Or maybe you'll decide you want to work with your whole school to effect a whole school change to approach. You might consider how ready are your teachers or your school community for change. This will help you decide how much time needs to be spent on preparation and persuasion before you jump in. You might also consider your teacher's current level of experience and expertise when you're planning your timeline. Tailoring to your context is an important part of planning for success. The evidence shows us that the teaching practices themselves work consistently across contexts and students, but the evidence shows context matters for the implementation piece, and it should be considered throughout your approach. The what means choosing the evidence-based teaching practice to focus on. Implementation is an investment. It will take time and it will take resources, both for you as a school leader and for teachers. It's important that you focus this effort on implementing practices that have been shown to make the biggest difference. Aero's teaching and learning model is a good place to start. And in terms of the how, the implementation research identifies 4 interdependent implementation components. The first component is to use a staged approach. The stages are to explore, prepare, deliver and sustain, and it helps you to know which stage you're in and what's coming next. The second component is to identify and act on enablers and barriers. The enablers will enable you to amplify what's working well. If you identify your barriers, you can address what's getting in the way. The third component is to select and use a combination of well-sequenced implementation strategies, such as professional learning, modelling, coaching. These are the activities that shift evidence-based practice from theory into everyday use. And the final component is to establish and monitor implementation outcomes, to track how implementation is going throughout each stage of the process. Implementation is not as easy to execute as we might wish. Even in a small system, ensuring that all of the inputs that reach schools are aligned and cohesive is an enormous challenge. There is a task for systems in this as well. It's not just up to schools to determine what needs to be done and how to do it. The system has an important role to play. The system can be responsible for providing policy direction and advice, resourcing, and also making sure that schools have the opportunity to take on this challenge with enough time and without distraction from other demands as far as possible. The worst thing that can happen is that a school finds the research, decides we're going to make this change, we're going to become explicit practitioners, we're going to move everybody to a more effective way of teaching so that our students' learning will be better. And then the system provides information, advice, resources that contradict that approach. It's very important for the system to align itself and to make sure that everything that it's saying and doing is supporting the right approach that teachers want to take. For the teacher, the result of unclear and unaligned or even conflicting inputs from the system is often confusion and frustration. It adds to the sense that teachers often say about feeling overburdened and overloaded. Now, I think that I have shared a lot of information with you, and it is late in the afternoon now. I did say, forgot to show you that one. There you go. Systems need to be coherent and very clear. I want to give you all of the different ways that you can find me and the work that we do in Australia at Aero. And I want to say that I think all of our students in Australia, in Morocco, in Portugal, have human brains. They all learn in the same way, and that is why explicit teaching works. It's an approach that matches the way the brain is designed to learn. So maybe it is possible for someone from Australia to come all this way and still be relevant in Morocco. I thank you for inviting me here today. An event like this reminds me that there are so many of us working towards the same goal of continually strengthening outcomes for our students. I think we can derive comfort from immersing ourselves among like-minded colleagues, even colleagues from the other side of the planet. We can gain nourishment from one another, but we mustn't get too comfortable. We mustn't become complacent. There is a great deal of work to be done. So, I hope that this forum brings you inspiration, that you learn, that you gather your arguments, and that you take with you the knowledge and confidence to return to your work in education and do what needs to be done, with evidence at your back. I wish you the very best for your endeavours, and I thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy if anybody has any questions they might like to ask. Thank you.
Azul, assalamu alaikum, good evening. We'd like to thank you very much for your presentation, which is very fruitful. So we are happy to be here with you.
Thank you.
You said at the beginning that maybe you are happy because you are here at this time. I assure you that it's the same, because this is the forum, but somewhere we cannot be here at this time. we can further in order to learn a lot of things in 2 days, which is the first forum in Morocco. So first you talked about direct instructions or explicit approaches, which we maybe try it in Australia in all schools, which is not the same here. It's not the same case here. Here we try this direct instructions just in few schools, and then we don't know if it will continue or not, or it stopped just in few years, because this may be a program of governments. Maybe if the government changes, everything is changes on. So this is the problem in Morocco. We tried a lot of approaches, we tried a lot of things, but we don't know really when we will have suitable approach or think that will be maybe successful in our system of education. So thank you very much. So I want to ask you a direct question also. So for teachers in Australia, are they social level I'm talking about, are they well paid, or maybe what are their situation there? We will talk about teachers there. Are they really, their situation is good, is better, is maybe better than the other functions, or because here in Morocco, it's not so good. So thank you very much.
Teachers in Australia, we have a workforce shortage. We do not have enough teachers. They will say they're not paid enough. I think everybody will say we're not paid enough. Nobody's ever paid enough. They have recently been paid more because we have a shortage and we need to encourage more teachers into the profession. Teachers work very hard, but they feel that they lack status in the community sometimes. They think that they're not respected as they would like to be. And part of the reason I'm interested in making sure teachers know about the evidence base for this approach is it will make sure they are very effective as teachers, and that will build their confidence and their success and their standing in the community. I was a teacher myself. I was a teacher in a secondary school. I taught history and English for many years, and many of the people on my staff have been teachers as well. So we're not all academics who don't understand what it's like to be in a classroom, which is why we spend so much time focused on translating research for teachers. We make it accessible and relevant for them and attractive for them. But I can tell teachers in Australia, if they'd like to come and try Morocco, they should do it because it's a wonderful country.
Hello everybody, Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for supporting that long way from Australia to here. It's not easy actually. Well, since you have started your speech or your explanations, I was actually asking myself, how far are you integrating artificial intelligence in your system, in your educational system? Are your teachers making or doing formations in AI? Because, as you know, the world is developing very fast, and the educational system should run before this artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you. I was quietly confident someone would ask a question along those lines because there's been so much discussion today about AI. I would encourage you to look at our website. We are doing some research about effective use of AI in education. At the moment in Australia, it's very mixed. Some places tried to ban ChatGPT and others just let it flourish and let schools and children do whatever they wanted with it. So it's very confused at the moment. There's no consistent policy position about it. My own feeling is we've recently banned the use of mobile phones in schools. Because I care very much about explicit teaching, I think that's a good thing because they are a distraction. And if we remove them, then the child focuses on the teacher, and that's what I want to see. I'm concerned about the use of digital technologies, sometimes for the same reason, that they can distract from the explicit teaching that we want the teacher to be delivering. So getting a good balance where technology augments or supports the work of the teacher, not distracts from it or replaces it, is optimal, I think. There has been research in the past. TIMS did a survey one year, and TIMS is the mathematics, international mathematics assessment, and surveyed, did the assessment obviously, but also surveyed students about their access to computers. And for students who did TIMS who were in year 4, because they do it in year 4 and year 8, in year 4, the students with more access to computers had lower results for mathematics. In year 8, it was the reverse. Students in year 8 with more access to computers had better results for mathematics. So it's one data point, but it suggests that too much technology too early is not going to be good for students when they're building basic knowledge. Thank you for your question.
Hello, Dr. Donovan, dear audience. First of all, welcome to our forum. It's the first one organized at a national level here in Morocco. I have got 2 questions, in fact. So the first one, can we say that explicit teaching is a one-size-fits-all? If we take into account, literature, Bloom's taxonomy, for instance, starting from remembering up to creating, and that is encouraging higher order thinking skills. Now, when we talk about explicit teaching, it sounds like it's very simplistic. So my question is, does it cater for students' different learning styles, differentiated instructions, and so on? This is number 1. Number 2, if we take into account, as you said, it fits for all the types of learning, starting from primary to secondary. Does this apply to university students as well? And how do we encourage, higher order thinking skills if we do apply direct instruction? Thank you.
Thank you. Such good questions. To the second one first, the approach is absolutely essential for novice learners. So and students in schools are mostly novice learners. I think my colleagues who work in universities would suggest most undergraduates are as well. And yes, this approach works very well for them. But as we get older and as we build knowledge, we are able to become more autonomous about the way we can expand our knowledge. But for schooling and, yes, potentially the early years of university as well, it's a completely appropriate approach. It is one size fits all in as much as we all have human brains and they all learn in the same way. But some people will learn at a greater pace than others. I would very politely suggest that I do not trust the evidence base behind learning styles. We've examined it very closely and I do not think it is robust. I think it is much safer to assume that the approach that says it is important for children to learn knowledge and the best way for them to learn knowledge is from an expert to teach it to them in a very careful, sequenced, considered way is much safer. There is a big risk if you say, look, some children don't like to learn that way, they can do it differently, that those children won't get to learn. And we cannot take that risk with children. We need to take the approach that we know will work for all of them. But it does not mean that teachers need to become robots. They don't need to teach in the same way, saying the same things at the same time. We're not talking about scripting lessons for teachers. We're saying you need to build your lessons around this approach, understanding that it needs to be small chunks, built up, lots of practice, assessment throughout so that we can ensure mastery. and opportunities when the students have got the knowledge, opportunities for them to apply it in novel ways. So, as Nuno said this morning, this is not the enemy of creativity. This is the fundamental piece for creativity to be able to happen. I can't be creative if I don't know anything about something I'm being asked to be creative about. I can't problem solve in something I have no knowledge of. We've got to focus on the importance of that knowledge building, and we should be going to the most effective and efficient way of making that happen. Thank you for your questions.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question is related much more to your last slide about leadership. So my question, I'm very much interested in teacher leadership research. So my question is as the following: how can teacher lead change inside the school? And could you provide any insights regarding this from the Australian educational system? Does the Australian educational system emphasizes teacher leadership from within schools? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think it is very hard for an individual teacher to decide to attempt this kind of change on their own. It's very hard from the beginning. I mentioned one of the preconditions for explicit teaching is effectively managed classrooms. It's very hard for an individual teacher to set a code for behaviour just inside one classroom. If the rest of the school doesn't support it, it means that the students don't understand the inconsistency. They know that your classroom is predictable and they understand the rules and routines, but they're different everywhere else. So I think my first response would be, wherever possible, that this not be something that is led by individual teachers, but if possible, it should be a whole school approach led by the school leadership, and it should be led for all of the teachers to be part of. Having said that, if you are the one person in the room who has seen this is what we need to do and the rest of the school is not interested, you should still go for it because it is absolutely the right thing to be doing. For school leaders who do decide to take a whole of school approach, I mentioned that there is some help that we've published now around implementation and how to go about implementing this sort of change. I think the first thing to be aware of is that it will take some time and it needs resources and it needs consistency. You need to stay the course, and you need to be ready to push back against the teachers who might be resistant and understand why they don't like it or they don't want to do it, understand that they've been doing everything a different way for a long time and they're defensive and they're protective of that. But you have evidence that this works for all students and it is more effective. So be ready to push back. Also be ready to protect the space for people to learn something new and practice it. Nobody is going to be really good at this immediately. They're going to feel like they don't know what they're doing and they're not good at it, and they need coaching and support, and they need to be able to build up skills. And of course, there is also a role for the system in this, to the extent that the system provides resources and policy direction. What would be really good would be to see the system backing in exactly this approach. And I believe that it is.
Bonjour tout le monde. Alors, en tant que professeur dans une école pionnière, مدارس ريادة, j'ai pratiqué l'enseignement explicite pendant toute une année. Est-ce que vous ne voyez pas que l'enseignement explicite est conçu pour les élèves en difficulté? Parce que dans ma pratique en classe, les élèves excellents s'ennuient beaucoup, surtout dans la phase modelage. Dans la phase modelage, les élèves excellents s'ennuient. C'est pas qu'il n'y a pas ils ont la motivation, les excellents aussi, à apprendre avec cette méthode. Mais est-ce que vous ne voyez pas que la partie surtout modelage dans l'enseignement explicite est conçue pour les élèves qui sont en difficulté?
Thank you so much for giving me the floor to ask this question. I've been practicing, and too recently, the explicit learning and teaching, and I came to the conclusion that in my pioneer school, where I'm practicing, I noticed that this kind of method and methodology could be not adapted to some students who have difficulties, like any kind of, namely in the party of modeling the behavior and the learning reaction of my students. Do you think that there is another way to touch on this regarding your experience?
In my experience and in our research, what is needed by some students is a more intensive dosage. They need more. It is the same approach, but maybe they need one teacher to be working with them or a small group of students. It is still the right approach to take, but it will take longer and it will need more resources.
I would thank you for your interesting presentation. My question is about the strategy adopted by the Australian government for the management of cultural diversity, especially as it related to indigenous community.
Yeah, the question is regarding the strategies adopted by the Australian government for the management of cultural diversity, especially when it relates to the indigenous communities in Australia.
Oh, what a great question. We could have another hour for me to talk to you about that. Perhaps we could talk directly offline, because I think we need to finish here now. Can I thank you again so very much? Sorry, but I will come back to you as soon as we're finished and we'll talk.
Thank you very much for your presentation. First of all, excuse my bad English, but I will try to explicit my idea. The big study findings you show here, I see that there is a higher achievement in the problem solving and skills. Is it true?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, regarding mathematics, I am mathematics supervisor. I have some need to clearness of that point. Is in this case no routine problems. In other way, problems now direct, now straight problem questions. Problem which needs mathematical deep understanding and analysis, in general high order thinking skills. How one should manage this aspect within the explicit teaching? What is the case in Australia? Thank you very much.
The sad case is you cannot teach creativity, you cannot teach critical thinking, you cannot teach problem solving. What you can teach is knowledge. You can make sure that the students have the knowledge on which they can practice these things. Creativity is innate. It is not something that a teacher can teach. They can provide content knowledge so that the students have something they can build on and work with. And you can encourage them to apply their knowledge in novel ways. You can give them new things to think about using the knowledge that you have ensured they have. The expectation, we used to talk all the time about 21st century skills, and it always seemed remarkable to me that we were still talking about 21st century skills in 2020 or whatever. We haven't changed. We're still human. There are no special skills that suddenly we need because we're in the 21st century. We still need knowledge, and we still need to be able to apply knowledge. So my short answer is The knowledge is what enables the students to solve the problems, to think creatively, to think critically. And that is one of the reasons why Project Follow Through, which was trying to improve student learning achievement, it was an accidental finding that their problem solving improved as well because they learned. Thank you for your question. Now we must stop. It's time to go. Thank you so much.